Welcome to Natural Habitat Adventures Daily Dose of Nature. Today's topic, Filming 101 for Nature and Wildlife Photographers, presented by NatHab Expedition Leader Charlie Reinertsen. I'm your host, Rob Mess. Thank you all so much for joining us here today. Take it away, Charlie.
Thanks, Rob, and thank you everyone for joining today. Today's webinar is really going to focus on how do you go about transitioning from being a photographer to being a photographer who also takes video. We're going to dive into techniques that I use, approaches that I use. We'll see some examples of my videography on various different projects. And this is really meant to be for myself, I'm trained in photography, and so I went to school and took classes and learned the technical aspect of how to build an image. And I never got that technical training for videography, and so I had to teach myself. I had to learn through different online courses and talking with different people who film. And in today's day and age, it's just not enough to be a photographer, sadly. You need to also have video content if you're going to try and raise awareness about the work that you're doing. And it's just fun to get to know another tool. I'm working on a project called the Northern Peatlands Project, and it's really designed to introduce people to this ecosystem that you might not have heard about before, but it's also one of the greatest climate and biodiversity solutions of our generation. And so as I've been working on that project, it begs for video content. It can't just be photographs because these ecosystems are places that are very hard for us to wrap our heads around. They're really unique, and they're places unlike anything that you see anywhere else. And so I'll give you some examples of that footage, and I'll talk to you about my pathway from photography to video. But just to give you an overview of today's chat, I'll introduce myself, talk about my path to where I am now, and then we'll dive into the photographer's guide to videography. At the end, we'll do a Q&A, so please submit your questions as we go, and we'll get to those at the very end. But just to get going here, my path to photography started as a research biologist working on a project studying softshell turtles. So here we have two different species. On the top left of the screen, you're seeing the smooth softshell turtle. Bottom right, you're seeing the spiny softshell turtle. Essentially, the Minnesota DNR wanted to know if these two populations are healthy within the Mississippi River watershed. And so my lab under Dr. Stephen Friedberg at St. Olaf College in Minnesota was out trapping turtles, collecting data from those turtles, collecting tissue samples so that we could do genetic analysis and determine if there's a great difference in genetic diversity between those two species. And what we found is that the smooth softshell turtle has significantly less genetic diversity than the spiny softshell turtle. And that told us that in all likelihood, that species is not as healthy because genetic diversity is an indicator of the health of a population, where low genetic diversity correlates with inbreeding, which can lead to vulnerabilities of that population. So I was working on this project, and the whole time that I was in the field trapping turtles, I was taking pictures. This is me with baby turtles that I raised from an egg and then had them in an aquarium in my lab while I was doing my research. They were my lab mates. And then I released them in the spring at the area where I trapped them. With turtles in particular, the greatest vulnerability for these species, is that first year of life. Because we don't have our top dog predators on the landscape, like wolves, some of our scavenger species have taken off. Their populations are huge. And so a raccoon will find a turtle nest and depredate all of the eggs. It's about 80% of all turtle eggs are eaten by scavengers. And so folks like me will raise turtles in an aquarium safely, because there are a lot of ways that you can do that poorly. and then reintroduce them to their habitat in the springtime. So anyway, that's the aside. I was a researcher in a lab doing research, and then I got to the end of that project and realized that as I was starting to communicate the results of our study, that's when I got really excited. I wasn't crazy about lab work. The field work was really fun, but certain aspects of it were less fun. And the photography part just captivated my imagination. And I just got so excited about capturing a picture that would make people ask questions and then using that as an on ramp to be able to get them excited about something about the biology of that animal. And so I met this incredible cast of characters at the Weaver Dunes Research Center in southeastern Minnesota. And that kind of spurred the rest of my career working in science communications and always dabbling in photography and video. This is another one of those characters that I met along the way. This is a saw-whet owl that we were banding and then gathering some data. Here's a UV light that's revealing what age this owl is, and then releasing that owl so that it can be recaptured and learn about the populations and where they're moving between. So as you can tell, I'm super passionate about all the different subjects that I photograph, and really it's kind of my on-ramp for learning about the world around me. I'll take a picture of something, I'll see something that I've never seen before, and then I'll do as much research as possible to figure out what is that, why is it important, and why should people care about this. And this project, this work has kind of brought me all over the world, working for various different clients. And one of my favorite clients to work for is Natural Habitat Adventures. When I'm guiding trips, I guide with the monarch butterfly migration in Michoacan, Mexico, which is a truly life-changing experience. I also guide on the Grand Teton and Yellowstone wildlife safaris. My career in science communications has, I've worked in the Intermountain West, I've worked mostly in the Northern Forest, and right now I'm calling in from Adirondack Park. So a lot of folks have heard about Adirondack Park, but kind of don't know what it is. And so this blue area up in New York State is the boundary of Adirondack Park, and it's a mix of private and public land. And from a geographic standpoint, you could fit Yellowstone Glacier, Grand Canyon, Great Smoky Mountains, and Yosemite within the boundary of Adirondack Park and still have room left over. So it's an incredibly vast wilderness area protected by the state, primarily because of development in this area and harvesting of trees that led to water quality issues in New York City. So those protections were put in place at the end of the 1700s into the early 1800s. Sorry, fact checking myself. Late 1800s is when we set aside this land and preserved it for wildlife and natural resource management. I moved to this area specifically to build a climate solutions exhibit for the Wild Center. So this 3,000 square foot interactive exhibit has my photography and video, as well as a ton of other artists and producers as well. And we were interviewing people in Adirondack Park who are working on climate solutions. And this really spurred my passion for peatlands, which are wetland areas that store an incredible amount of carbon and also are home to species that can't live anywhere else. So through talking with people who we featured in this exhibit, it really started to shape the rest of my career. When I launched my business, Two Line Studio, I support various different conservation groups and outdoor companies. And then I also have my own projects, like the Northern Peatlands Project, that are just projects that I need to do that I think are the best and highest use of my skill set to be able to make an impact and help conserve this incredible planet that we find ourselves in. So this is my website. You can find all my work here, twolined.com. That's named after the salamander that you find in this area in the Northern Forest. And this is a little introduction to some of my cinematography and our peatlands. So right here, we're flying up with a drone, and we'll talk about settings pretty soon. We're going to get into the nitty gritty of how do you make footage like this. And these places are just a playground for me. They have all these bodies of water kind of peppering this larger landscape that's just covered in a blanket of sphagnum moss that is a riot of color throughout the whole year until it gets blanketed in snow. And there's tamarack trees that right now are bright yellow during this season. And those springs of water in the center, they just create for this really interesting kind of abstract scenery that, as you can see from that video, it's just really fun to be able to riff off of. All right, let's get into what you're here for, which is the actual technical aspects of how do you go about producing films. And this is really, like I mentioned, geared towards someone who is familiar with photography, knows about those settings that you're adjusting to be able to take a great picture, but doesn't know how to apply those when they start to get into video. And for me, myself, that was kind of this mysterious box that I didn't open until 5 years ago when I started to really want to get into video. And the tips for this are fairly similar to how to approach photography. And for me, the breakdown is 3 steps. First, know your subject. Sorry, 4 steps now that I'm looking at the whole list here. Know your subject. If you talk to any wildlife photographer, videographer, the first thing they're going to tell you is you need to know the behaviors of that wildlife, or you need to know the aspects of that landscape, how the sun is interacting with the landscape and the different variables there. Second, you need to know the variables of your camera. So you need to know all of the different things that you can adjust to be able to problem solve when you're in the field. You can rely on auto settings if you want, but that's only going to get you so far. You need to drill into some key areas that I'll outline in this talk to be able to manipulate the composition and the lighting of every scene. And then you want to make a plan. I find it's great to be dynamic, to just go out with your camera and take footage. But if you don't have a plan, it can get really overwhelming because we're dealing with gigantic files. And so for me, having a plan of what I want to photograph, what I want to take a video of, is going to help me not just take a million photos and videos. It's going to help me strategize and minimize the excess, the fat, right? And this is just my personal approach. I don't like to have just gobs of files that I have to go through. I like to have just the ones that I think are headed in the right direction. And then finally, you want to adapt, because when you get out, all the rules go out the window. Sometimes you don't have time to be able to change things perfectly and adjust the settings just how you want. You're going to have a quick decision of what settings you're going to grab. You're going to get the shot and hopefully be happy with the outcome. So let's dive into that first category. Know your subject. This one for me is paramount. You have to know your subject. If I'm going to be filming monarch butterflies in the winter, I need to know exactly where they are, what types of activities they're doing, and I need to know kind of the ecosystem, the habitat, to understand what lighting constraints there might be, or what this animal is doing at different times of day, so that I can set myself up to be in position for the shot that I'm looking for. This was a fleeting moment just looking out through the Oyamel fir forest over this landscape of transvolcanic mountains, this central belt of mountains in Mexico. And those dots in the sky, those are all monarch butterflies. So this was just a really quick moment that was really beautiful, because the temperature had warmed up just enough for the butterflies to take flight far enough away from the trees where they're usually roosting to be able to get a shot like this. So you really need to know your subject. In this image, it would go a long way to have light spotlighting so that you could understand that the reason why the branches are facing down is that they're covered in monarch butterflies. Uh, so just understanding the ecology of the creature that you're photographing and positioning and your limitations. For instance, in the Butterfly Biosphere Reserve, there are trails that you must stay on, and you have to either hike a very long way or take a horse followed by hiking to get to the top. And so you have to think about what gear you're going to need to be able to get the shot. Often there will be an area that's roped off that keeps you at a distance from what you're trying to photograph. So if you want a shot like this, you need at least a 200 to 400 millimeter lens. And obviously, right now I'm using photographs to talk about this, but in a moment, I'll show you video from these same places and kind of talk about how I'm approaching that video. But all the same principles apply for this topic, which is know your subject. So once you get out into the area where the butterflies are spending their time and they're clustered on the branches and on the trees, you need to know that the ecology of this animal, they are going to take flight exactly at the moment when they heat up to a certain level. So if sun is hitting this area, which it is right now in this photo, you need to know that soon enough, if you're patient, those butterflies are going to heat up, and then there's going to be a cascade of butterflies flying off of that branch, taking flight because they reached that temperature at which they need to cool down. So if you know the ecology, it can set you up to be able to get the proper framing and circumstances to be able to get the shot that you want. And you can have a lot of bad techniques in videography, but if you know your subject and you get yourself in enough positions of really great content, you will get there. Like eventually you'll learn the settings. The hardest part is being able to get the composition that you want. In this shot, the challenge is getting the focusing distance right to be able to find the plane at which the butterflies are existing. And then it's shutter speed because these animals are moving very quick. So you just want to set that focus distance and then get your shutter speed way up there to be able to capture the movement and freeze movement in this instance. So you get the idea. You want to be there for the moment when all of these butterflies take flight, and you want to have in your head the composition that you want to achieve when that moment happens. And it comes down to patience. Everything with photography, when it comes to wildlife photography, is about the right moment at the right time. And the only way that you get there is by being very, very patient. So you set up, you figure out your composition, you think about how the light is going to be when that moment happens that you want to capture. And then it's a waiting game. You wait until this moment happens when the butterflies are above you, creating a river of butterflies in the sky. And then you want to think about with filmmaking, you're trying, just like photography, you're trying to tell a story. And for me to tell a story, you have to get a diversity of compositions. You want to get close up footage of your subject. You want to get a distance from your subject. You want to try and tell it from as many angles as possible. And I find it's really rewarding to do the close up story. That one, the imagery is super crisp, it's tack sharp, the colors are really vibrant, and with video, when you move into that world, it can be really, really fun to start to work on your macro videography skills. So this is just another example of know your subject. If you know that in the springtime there's a mass migration of salamanders, then you need to build all of the shots in your head so that you're ready for the one night when thousands of salamanders are crossing the road. Maybe this is a bad example. Maybe you're more interested in getting the perfect sunset over a mountain scene. But for me, it's all salamanders. And so every year in the spring, I'm planning and thinking about the shots that I want to get that I haven't gotten yet of salamanders crossing the road. And I'm getting creative. So it's using light sources like headlamps that are a stable source of light that aren't going to bother the subject too much as they're crossing the road or once they've safely crossed the road. And then it's thinking about different compositions. And in this instance, I got a mirror and laid it down in the path of the salamander, made sure that that mirror didn't have any chemicals on it at all, because these animals are really susceptible to chemicals because they breathe through their skin, and then allowed the salamander to walk across that mirror as it was moving along its way on its migration to be able to get to its spawning grounds. And as it was moving across, I captured this image because this particular salamander is the four-toed salamander, and they're about this long, 2 inches long, and their bellies are spotted. So they've got these beautiful spots, and I wanted to have the mirror in the shot to be able to reveal that as the salamander is moving across. So it's very similar to photography when you start to dive into video, because you're just trying to figure out, it's problem solving. You know the shot that you want. Now, how do you get it? And how do you get those settings so that they're going to give you the proper exposure and lighting feel that you're looking for? Another aspect of what we'll touch on today is a lot of my video work is through drones. And so thinking about how are you going to position a camera that has infinite options to be able to give you the best composition possible. And there's new technology now that's allowing you to GPS lock your location so that you can get the same location over time. So here is a transition, one location from summer until winter, or on the edge of winter as we head into winter. So there's so many variables out there, but really just think of it as a playground that you can create a plan, go out there, know your subject, research the hell out of it, and then try and get exactly what you're looking for. All right, now we've moved on. This is going to be the super technical aspect of the conversation where we're going to dive into what are the settings that you need to use to understand video so that you can go out right after this talk and start to actually take some really nice footage. And this is called Know Your Variables. So this is an image of the back side of my camera, just of the screen. I have a Nikon Z8. Your camera is going to be different depending on what model you have, what type of camera you have, but they're all going to manipulate the same settings. So even if yours might look different, I'll kind of talk you through where to look. In video, when you're shooting video, I always use manual mode. You want to manipulate every variable, and you never want your camera to take over. That is the biggest downfall for video. In photography, I'm always shooting aperture priority. Unless I want to do something fancy with the lighting, the camera does such a good job of getting the proper exposure, and then you can always bracket, or you can always grab the exposure and dump it down while you're in aperture priority. But with videography, I'm always using manual settings. So I'm selecting everything and then referencing the exposure of the camera itself to be able to see how I'm doing. That's step one. Step two, for me when I'm filming, I'm not a Hollywood filmmaker. I'm not shooting 8K. I'm not shooting some ridiculous file size. 24 frames a second gives me most of the work that I want to do, unless I'm planning to slow the footage down, or if I'm shooting a subject that is really fast moving. So what you're looking at here, 2160 refers to the size of the video that you're shooting. 2160 is another word for 4K. So I'm usually shooting 4K footage. This is a huge file size. You can crop into it and still maintain the quality of the image. I find that I can crop in at like 130% of 100%. So 100% would be the video is filling your screen. If I bump into 130%, the image quality is still great in most lighting circumstances. The P24 refers to the frame rate. And for most of what I do, I'm shooting 24p. And what that's going to do is make sure that you have silky smooth footage as long as you're on a tripod, or if you're flying a drone, you're moving very slowly, or if you are using some sort of gimbal and you're moving at a fairly slow pace. When I'm doing a lot of my landscape videography work, I'm, for the most part, you can speed your footage up in post processing um, successfully, and it looks really smooth as long as there aren't moving vehicles or things moving in the image that would be upsetting to see move at 2 times speed. But I film slow so that I can edit fast, if that makes sense. Uh, nice. I'm getting some thumbs in the chat of people saying that they understand what I'm saying, which is helpful. All right, so 4K footage, 24 frames a second. Unless if I'm trying to film a blue jay flying in really quickly, then I'm going to bump it up to 60 frames a second. Maybe I'll bump it up to 120 frames a second. But remember that this is an extra variable. This is not a variable that you're familiar with from photography. So this will impact how much light is coming in to your sensor effectively. If you do 24 frames a second, you're letting in lots of light. If you're doing 60 frames a second, it's like going down a hole or even 2 whole stops, right? All right, we'll come back to that. Moving on to the next one. The next one is your shutter speed. And the only thing you need to know about this, you don't need to understand the mechanics of what's happening. But this number, this 60, that number needs to be twice the value of whatever frame rate you are shooting every time. So if I'm shooting 24 frames a second, I always manually select 1/60 for my shutter speed. If I'm shooting at 60 frames a second, so it would be P star 60 up here next to the 2160, I would then bump up to at least 120, 1/120 for a shutter speed, if not higher. So 1/160 probably. The next variable that I'm going to look at, and I'm going to look at them side by side, is going to be the f-stop. F-stop in video, this is just an example. I'm sad that I grabbed that. I was just taking a picture before this webinar. I'm almost always shooting very close to wide open on my f-stop. Unlike photography, you're not trying to get like f16 or f12 for your landscape photos. I'm usually down at like f5.6 or f8. And then you adjust your ISO. Now, in the photography world, you can bump your ISO so high on the latest cameras. Right now I'm shooting with a Z8. It's insane how much ISO you can push without getting too much grain in your image. We also have all this photo editing software that can remove grain. That's not okay in video. In video, you have to shoot as low ISO as possible to get the proper exposure for the scene. So for me, I'm always trying to sit at like ISO 100 is the dream, and then 400, I don't like to be there. I like to be, this is a rule that I follow for the highest quality images. I want my ISO to be as low as possible. And that's ISO is just sensitivity to light, right? All right. The next variable that you have to think about for videography, and this is one that photographers are kind of in two camps. Some photographers are using neutral density filters all the time. So what that is just a little filter you screw on to the end of your camera, and it reduces how much light is coming in to the camera, hopefully without affecting the color. And that's why they're called neutral density. You can get them at different f-stops, so you can block more light depending on what value you get of an ND filter. So usually you want to buy a set of ND filters that will just barely block light all the way up to you're shooting in full sun, it's bright as hell, and you need really, really dense filters to be able to compensate. So that's the next variable. So essentially, just to walk through this again, I select manual mode, 2160, 24 frames a second, as long as it's nothing moving fast. 1/60 if I'm using 24 frames a second. And then usually f-stop around 5.6, maybe a little bit lower depending on the lens, depending on what I'm shooting. And then my ISO as low as possible. And if it's overexposed at that point, then I slap an ND filter on. So if you're looking at your meter and it's telling you, gosh, you're multiple stops over, you tried an ND filter, and then if that's still not enough, you throw a heavier ND filter on after that. The next thing to be aware of is this is the light evaluating meter that your camera is using. I like this setting, which is highlight priority setting. So your camera, you can tell it how to evaluate the light that it's seeing. And this is the way that you tell it what you want it to do. Most people, you'll see like this icon that's kind of a filled in square, but it's broken up into 4 quadrants with a dot in the center. That's full frame evaluative sensoring. It's just going to read how much light is in the entire sensor and then find the average for your exposure and tell you if you're over or under while you're in manual exposure mode. If you select highlight priority evaluation, highlight priority metering, it's only going to read the brightest parts of the image and then develop an exposure for that. So for instance, if in the center of this image there was a deer, and that deer happened to be in a spotlight of light, you can imagine just a ray of light hitting the deer in the face, and it's the brightest part of the whole image. Everything else is dark. If you're doing highlight priority, it's going to tell you perfect exposure on the brightest part of your image. So you're protecting the highlights from getting blown out. So that's what I'm shooting with. And then the last thing that I'll do is make sure that I've engaged striping across overexposed areas. So in this image on the right, you're seeing all this black and white striping across the image, and that's everything that's blown out, everything that's overexposed. So I select that and I start with my exposure so that it's just the whole thing is blown out and everything's striped. And then I use my dial on the camera to drop down. Usually it's the f-stop that I'm manipulating, starting at like f12 and then coming down. Sometimes it's adding neutral density filters to the camera, and sometimes it's ISO. So in this instance, the ISO is way too high, and I'd be bumping the ISO down until I remove all of those stripes. And once you get to that point, you're perfectly exposed for the scene. And that evaluative metering icon is over here right now on that stripe scene, if you're looking for what that icon looks like. All right, if you're still with me, if I haven't lost everyone going into the technical aspects, the next thing I think about is focus. Now, cameras at this point have reached a new place. If I'd been giving this webinar even 2 years ago, maybe a year ago, I would tell you that no matter what, you need to use manual focus. You need a monitor to make sure that everything is in focus that you want in focus, and to set it and forget it. So get it locked into what you want, and then don't touch it, because any touching that you do on your camera is going to bump it and cause shaking in your video. We're in a new place. For example, I'm using Nikon Z8, and you have this autofocus feature where you just create a box inside the camera. That red box that's inside on the viewfinder, everything within that, it will detect subjects and lock into eyes. You can select bird, you can select animal, you can select people, And if the subject is inside that box, I guarantee it's going to lock in and give you the sharpest footage you've ever seen. It's insane. The other thing that I'm highlighting here is in the right-hand side of the screen is that you move that focus area around the screen by using that little toggle. That's a really valuable tool to have, and not all cameras come with that. All right, so those were the technical aspects. If you want a cheat sheet, I'll be making those available at the end of this month. October 31st is when they're going to drop. I'm going to create essentially a tutorial video and then also a cheat sheet that will give you everything you need to know that we just walked through. So shoot me an email, charlie@twoline.com, if you're interested in that. On to the next category. So we know our subject, we know our variables. Now we're going to get in the field and adapt. And that's what it's all about. So this is an example of a subject that is incredibly bright. You think about monarch butterfly wings, they're orange. Sometimes your camera, when it's evaluating the scene of something really bright, it's going to overexpose. And so something I like to do is when we're talking about the stripes, remember we get the striping, the highlight, not blown out areas. We get them all the way gone by dropping down the f-stops or the ISO. This image is super underexposed because I know that what I'm looking at, the camera is going to interpret it differently than I want it to. And so here's the histogram from this photo. Again, we're looking at photography. It applies to video. So in this instance, I shot it really dark because I wanted that orange to just look like it's illuminated. It's also slightly backlit. These monarch butterflies, again, you need to know the ecology of what you're photographing. So these butterflies, they get really thirsty and they like to congregate in areas where there's seeping water. So this moment was captured while they were all congregated around this little puddle of water. And I was able to use a 200 millimeter lens to be able to get that close-up shot. One of the things that once I had visited this area, I knew I wanted to try and capture the feeling of being in a snow globe. Because when you're here, you feel like you're in a snow globe of butterflies. And for me, if I was using a aperture that was like f/16 with everything in focus, it just didn't do it. It just wouldn't make it work. And so what I ended up doing was a super wide aperture with a really long lens to compress everything, to make everything feel closer together to one another, and then to film at that so that the butterflies they get larger when they're out of focus. So only a very shallow plane is in focus, and it creates kind of that snow globe feel. Here's another example of underexposing because I wanted the highlights to be protected. And this, you'll see it in the footage that I'm about to share. I wanted an entirely out of focus film so that the butterflies just felt like these moving dots in the composition, to just give a sense of how many butterflies were there. And because they would get lit up in these little pockets of light, and I felt like when they were all out of focus, you could really start to get a sense for that. Finally, my last tip before we look at some examples of footage is do your homework and know your heroes. A few people who I'm inspired by all the time, Jaime Rojo, he just published all of this work on monarchs with National Geographic, and ever since then, he's just been gaining in notoriety for his work capturing the conservation story of the species. He has all these incredible stories of how he has been working on this project and has captured just some truly magnificent photos and videos. The other person who really inspires me is Bertie Gregory. He's done a lot of cinematography for National Geographic and a number of different places. And his ability to talk about what he does is the thing that inspires me the most. He's able to talk like as if he's a friend to you about what he does and try and get other people more excited about it. And so he's an inspiration in that way. Joel Sartor is building the photo arc, so he's working with captive animals, and his ability to manipulate lighting to communicate a feeling is amazing. And the last one, Anna Atkins, is the first photographer in history. She was using cyanotypes, which is just this light sensitive pigment, to be able to capture images of algae. And she's like the number one inspiration for me, because it's this amazing intersection of art and science, where she wanted to catalog all the species of algae so that we could better understand them, but she was also creating this gorgeous work where she was carefully creating the perfect exposure to expose all of the structures of these plants. If you've enjoyed today's talk, I've got another talk coming up with NatHab on the 1st of November. That's going to be focused on the challenges of photographing one of the most iconic species in the nation, the bison. You can check out more of my work at twoline.com, but before we go to questions, I'm just going to share a different screen. And just a second here. All right. So I was very lucky to be featured on Nikon's website. I've been working with Nikon over the last year. They've been publishing photos and videos of my work on the Northern Peatlands project to be able to help raise awareness of this ecosystem. And so if you search Charlie Reinertsen plus Nikon, you'll be able to get this article, and we'll even link to it in the chat. But we'll just watch this video that's on the main landing page. And this is the next phase. So once you get all the technical aspects comfortable and in a good place, the next phase is editing all that footage, telling a story through it, and trying to captivate imagination. So here's my attempt to be able to explain what the heck I'm doing with the Northern Peatlands project.
They purify the water we drink. They keep our planet cool by storing vast amounts of carbon. But one thing is certain: if we don't grow a fan base for our global peatlands, these ecosystems and the biodiversity that they nourish may not persist in a changing climate. It is going to take action on all levels to restore and protect these ecosystems, and to ensure that these wild places continue to provide the astounding array of ecosystem services we depend on to survive. My work strives to bring one of the greatest climate solutions of our generation into the spotlight, to uncover the mysteries that our peatlands hold, and to ignite a sense of wonder for one of the wildest places on Earth. Welcome to our Northern Peatlands.
All right. So that gives you a sense of what I'm working on and why I'm doing it. And it was really hard to go through my hours of footage to be able to figure out which ones I wanted to share in that short documentary. But the next one that I wanted to show you, let's see if I can pull this one up. I've been teasing you with all the Monarch content, so I wanted to show you what that looks like. And, you know, to be honest, this footage that I'm sharing right now is not going to look great on your screen, so I'll drop a couple links in the chat so that you can see these and stream them at 4K to be able to see the full quality. So this is some footage from the Monarch Butterfly Biosphere Reserve.
And it's roll on, my friend, and it's roll on, my friend. I return you once more when your wait is done. I return you once more when your wait is done. And it's roll on, my friend, and it's roll on, my friend. I'll return you once more. When your wait is done, I'll return you once more. When your wait is done.
All right. So I'm going to share presentation screen again here in just a second. And thanks for your patience. There it is. All right, so just to go back to that footage from the Monarch Butterfly Biosphere Reserve, that was from 2 years ago. And that was the exact inflection point at which I dedicated myself to really learning videography. Because before that, I kind of used my photography knowledge to get by, but I had never really studied up on video. And after visiting the Butterfly Biosphere Reserve, I took that footage and I put that video together and I said, gosh, I wish I knew how to do this the right way. So that was really the inflection point where I looked at that footage and said, there are so many technical issues with what I want to do differently, and then applied myself to figuring out how filmmaking works. So if you happen to be in the Adirondacks in Essex, New York, I'll be driving down there in just a couple minutes here, and I've got an artist talk tonight. I'll be sharing 50 minutes of footage from our peatlands while talking about this project, and I'll also have a pop-up artist gallery with 14 large-scale framed prints for sale as well. So if you happen to be in Essex, Vermont, or Essex, New York, come join me. And if you'd like to subscribe to monthly publications from the field, talking about our peatlands and diving into these places, scan that QR code or go to twoline.com/tracks, and you'll be able to see all of my work in that area. And if you would like to read that article that I referenced and see that video streamed at much higher quality, you can visit Nikon's Learn and Explore and then go to their Ideas and Inspiration tab. You can also just search Reinertsen plus Nikon to find the article. And here's all my contact information. Feel free to get in touch if you want that cheat sheet at the end of the month. Send me an email. And I would love to wrap up the last couple minutes here with some questions. Thank you.
All right, Charlie, thank you so much. Now, before we start in with the question and answer session, I would like to remind everyone that you can submit your questions via the question field in your control panel. All right, let's get to these questions. So one of our guests is wondering if they are shooting video handheld, is 30 FPS and 1/200 okay?
So it's the other variable that I really didn't talk about today is lens length. And so the longer your lens, the more shake is going to be introduced to your video. The other thing that we didn't talk about is post-production. So if you're shooting at a really big file size, like 4K, maybe even bigger, you do have warp stabilization, which essentially just gets rid of shake by cropping into the video and then using AI to compensate for the shaking of what you're doing. It also comes down to your ability to move smoothly. If you can move smoothly, or if the type of film that you're filming is okay to have shaking. For instance, if I'm shooting landscape footage, maybe a time lapse of clouds moving across the scene, I can't handhold that. That's going to be a huge problem. But if I'm following a person as they walk along a trail, a little bit of camera movement can actually help tell the story and make the viewer feel like they're there. So like anything, this is going to be a it depends answer. But at the same time, if you use a super wide angle lens, like a 20 millimeter, that's going to be a lot more forgiving for handheld video than if you're using a 70 or even a 100 millimeter or 200 millimeters. That's going to be very hard to hand hold. The other trick that I'll say, videographers, it's really expensive to get gimbals. It's expensive to get into this world. One of the ways that I've gotten around it is I just have a ball head tripod for my camera for all of my photography work. And when I'm photographing wildlife, you have to be nimble to be able to follow a bird. So I'll set that ball head so that it's holding the camera, but that I can still swivel it. So it's finding that perfect spot. And then I'm able to kind of use it as if it's one of those really fancy L-bar supports for your camera. Another trick to use is a monopod. Mount your camera to a monopod and then you can pivot around it, rest that on the ground, and it gives you some level of stability. So it really depends on what you're shooting, what you're doing. In terms of your settings, I find that handheld 24p or 30p frames per second, with the settings that you described, I think you said 1/200, that's going to be fine. It'll create smooth imagery as long as your subject isn't running. It also depends on the size of the subject. And so at the end of the day, you just have to test stuff out. And then when you get onto a bigger screen, you have to reevaluate, because sometimes it looks great on your little screen. You get home and you realize it's terrible. So just play around and play with your settings.
Great. Thank you, Charlie. And so is that some of your advice too for achieving great panning? Do you have any other things to help us with panning?
So a lot of videographers would cringe at what I'm about to say. Something that I do often, and it all depends on where your videos are going. If your end result is to post on YouTube and most people are looking on their phones or on a screen that's not much bigger than 12 by 18, you can get away with what I'm about to tell you. You can shoot from a tripod and just get a single shot that captures much more than what your final pan is going to reveal. Then, when you're editing your footage, punch in to no more than 130%, right? So usually you bring in your video to something like Premiere Pro, which is maybe your editing software, and it'll say that your video is showing up in your screen at 100%. Punch it into 130%, and then there are these little clocks next to the scale and the position of your video. Hit those clocks. And what that does is you can create a pan zoomed in on the footage that you have across what you're doing. So you can actually like effectively get the raw footage of what's happening, and in post-production punch into it and move across that field of view. So for me, because I don't have a gimbal, because I don't have all that fancy equipment, and because most of my work at this moment in time is not going to be on the big screen, it's going to be on little screens, you can get away with punching in like that. But what it means is you've got to have crystal clear laser focus on your subject. It's got to be perfectly lit, and you have to be really careful that you don't punch too far in. And then your movement that you introduce needs to be slow. Everything needs to be slow. You can't pan quickly. The biggest problem that you see with footage is people trying to pan too fast. You need to give your eye time to be able to move through the image. And then the other thing too is a lot of times the video that I shoot is literally just to post on Instagram, because nobody likes looking at photos. Everybody engages with videos. And so a lot of times I'll shoot a video horizontal and then I'll crop into vertical just to create a reel on Instagram. And it feels a little bit cheap. It cheapens the product, but it's how you get engagement on social media. So that people eventually, they see the video and then they're like, oh, what's this about? And they see the photos that you're trying to push. Yeah, thanks for that question.
Any advice on how we can film the northern lights and night skies in general?
Yeah, that's super tough. The only way you'll be able to do it with most cameras that anybody has that doesn't have $1 million is through time lapse. So you're gonna have to be very patient, right? And I thought about doing this the other night. I was photographing Northern Lights, and I wanted to create a video. And you have to set up your photo with a really high ISO so that the shutter speed is about 1/8. Um, and then you need to create a time lapse. Usually cameras can run those all in-house inside the camera software. Set up a time lapse for about 2 hours, taking a photo every 2 seconds at that 1/8 standpoint, perfectly exposed for everything at that point in time. So usually your ISO is going to be like at 10,000. If you're trying to do Northern Lights, your ISO will be at 10,000. Your F is going to be 2.8 or as wide as that thing goes. 1/8 on the exposure, and then set up a time lapse for 2 hours. You're probably only going to get like a little bit that's usable if Northern Lights were happening during that time. And that's the only way you're going to be able to film Northern Lights unless you have a Hollywood camera. Um, and good for you if you can buy one of those.
Thanks, Charlie. So is the priority meter setting the same as a spot meter setting?
Spot meter is you're going to tell your camera which spot to expose for, but highlight priority, the camera reads the image and then exposes for the brightest point. So highlight priority is my preference because I'm always trying to protect all of the highlights in the image. But there can be circumstances where it's like, ooh, I don't care if highlights get blown out. I want to make sure that that dark animal is perfectly exposed. So I'm going to select point specific, and then I'm going to tell the camera where in my um, sensor I want it to expose.
Gotcha. Thank you. So do you have any tips on how to maybe upload our video so it doesn't lose resolution on social media and YouTube?
Yeah, so Instagram is allowing you to post from desktop. So my biggest tip is to upload to Vimeo if you can get a Vimeo account. And then from Vimeo, you can download any file size. And I download the biggest one first, um, and then upload that file onto Instagram from desktop. And it might take a while to upload a 2-minute film at 4K. And then Instagram does all of its compression on its own. So it's not actually posting that huge file, but if you give it a huge file to process, it'll come out really crisp. But I've found that Instagram does a great job when you're posting a reel. The quality viewing the reel is great, but if you post that reel to your story, the quality goes to crap. So that's just like a little thing there. And then YouTube and Vimeo, both of those take huge file sizes. You can post as big as you want. You can export your file at 4K, which is the native camera setting that you were filming at if you followed this tutorial. And then it shows up great.
Great.
Yeah,
Awesome.
that one might take a longer answer in a future webinar.
Well, we look forward to it. Unfortunately, that will be the last question that we do have for this webinar. So I would like to hand it back to you for your closing comments.
Feel free to reach out, and it would go a long way if you follow me on Instagram. I'm trying to break through their algorithm and let me spam everyone with Pete content. So following and liking my photographs there will go a long way to trying to get the word out. And please subscribe to the newsletter by going to twoline.com/tracks. But thanks for tuning in. If you have questions, shoot me an email.
All right, Charlie, thank you so much for taking the time to present for us today. And I'd also like to thank everyone who joined us today. If you're interested in information on how you can travel with NatHab, give us a call at 800-543-8917 or send us an email at info@nathab.com. Our adventure specialists are happy to help you out. Join us tomorrow for our next Daily Dose of Nature. You can check out this week's lineup, including registration links, on our website at nathab.com/webinars. We did record today's presentation, and we will have the replay available on our website soon. With that, I will conclude the webinar. Goodbye, everybody. We'll see you next time.